Without further ado, we are now in for a real treat. My colleague and friend, Liz Weintraub, who is AUCD's Senior Policy Specialist and the host of a weekly YouTube video series called Tuesdays with Liz, Disability Policy for All, will moderate a panel of 3 rising stars in the disability movement. And if you guys can start to make your way up, that would be great. Those 3 rising stars are Haben Girma, Conchita Hernandez, and Maria Town. I'd like to remind everybody in the audience that any questions for Liz and the panel can be written down on the note card on your chair. Note cards will be collected starting at 9:30 for anyone who has a question, and if you need assistance filling yours out, please let a staff member know. So again, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Liz and our esteemed panel.
Thank you, Andy. This is Liz Weintraub. Can you please briefly introduce yourself before we get started? And we'll start with Maria Haben.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As you heard, my name is Haben Girma. The name comes from Eritrea, a small African country. Ethiopia is to the south, and to the north is the Red Sea. And my parents came from Eritrea and Ethiopia. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I had access to the disability rights movement, which gave me so many more opportunities than many disabled students around the country. And it's my hope that we can get to the point where all disabled students have the same choices as non-disabled students. And I now work as an advocate to help us reach that goal.
Maria.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Town, and I serve as the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. The cheers, I think, are because I'm relatively new in this position. Prior to this, I served as the director of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities in the city of Houston, and previously was the disability liaison for President Barack Obama. I am so proud of the work I'm able to do because AAPD is a cross-disability organization. So we work to advance the rights of all 61 million Americans with disabilities every day. And so with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Conchita.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Conchita Hernandez. So I was originally born in Mexico. I immigrated to the United States with my family. I grew up in California, just like Haben. And so I was an English learner, blind, going through the school system. I was not connected to the disability rights movement, as Haben had mentioned in her story, and so it was definitely detrimental. I grew up being undocumented, so that adds another layer onto the experience of growing up with a disability. And I currently work for the Department of Education in Maryland as the blind and low vision low incidence specialist, and I also run a nonprofit where we do work in Mexico, kind of giving back to where I come from and how we can provide services there. So I'm also a doctorate student at George Washington University, getting my doctorate in special education with a focus on English learners that are blind and low vision. And so I like to mix the disability, advocacy, rights movement and proudness, and also research and evidence-based practices, and how those two can come together, because I don't think we're doing a good job at the moment of bringing those together. So thank you, Liz.
Thank you. This is Liz, and one of my favorite sayings is all means all. It's really a way to talk about belonging. What is your advice to all of us to create belonging in the disability movement? We'll start with Hopkins.
I'm going to start. And my background is deaf blindness. I grew up with limited vision and hearing, which has decreased over time. And there were disability groups in the Bay Area, but they didn't follow Liz's advice that all means all. So one group was only focused on blindness issues, and if you were blind and had additional disabilities, it was difficult to get access. Or if I tried to interact with the deaf community, I was always the last one to find out something and was missing out on so much visual information. So I had to keep asking myself, what can I do to have full access? How do we break all the barriers? And I started asking myself, what are my strengths? What touch, Braille is one of my strengths. So I started looking into communication channels that maximized my access to Braille. And what we're doing this morning, there are typists in the front who are typing on a keyboard that's connected to the Braille computer I have here. And they type what the speakers are saying up on stage and feedback from the audience, and I'm reading it in Braille. This is a very unique solution. When I developed it, I did not know any other people who used this solution. Since then, I've heard of a deaf-blind woman in Australia who uses this system, and other people around the world. But we had to be creative and thoughtful and come up with solutions. And in order to have this kind of inclusion that celebrates disabled innovators and leaders, we need to be really flexible in serving people. Make sure we provide information in multiple formats. If someone comes to us with a new kind of accommodation that we've never heard of before, be open to working with them instead of simply denying them access. There is still so much discrimination and barrier within the disability community, and we need to work together to remove those barriers. So people with multiple disabilities or people with language challenges due to not speaking English as a first language, immigrant communities, all communities should be welcomed. And we can do that by providing information in multiple formats and being flexible.
I would just, this is Maria Town, and I would like the record to show that I completely agree with everything Haben just said. And I would like to add to it. So I have cerebral palsy. I identify very proudly as someone with a developmental disability and as a wobbly person. And growing up, when I would tell someone that I had cerebral palsy or CP, they would often look at me with a confused expression. And they would say things like, "Oh, you have CP, but you don't look like you have CP." And that's because they expected someone with cerebral palsy maybe would have speech difficulties or perhaps used a wheelchair or other kinds of spasticity. And there are many people with cerebral palsy who do. But throughout my upbringing, I was made to feel special and unique because I was high functioning. Guess what? High functioning, low functioning, that binary is a trap. And in order to create belonging within the DD and IDD community, we have to blow that binary out of the water. And we have to do so in the cross-disability movement as well. And so now, as an adult, I will often, again, put my DD identity forward because I think it is so important to show that I will still need accommodations, right? That anyone, no matter how significant their disability, can be a leader in any space they decide to be a leader.
Yes, and I also agree with everything that's been said. We'll just go to the next question. No. So when I think of all means all, I think it's beyond all the people we know. It's who do we not know that is not currently at the table? Who do we not know that is not currently receiving services or benefiting? There's so many amazing projects and programs and research that is happening across the network that so many people are not benefiting from. And so, I learned about the disability rights community and about disability in general my senior year of college. And people were like, that's great. I'm like, no, that's horrible. I should have known about it way, way, way ahead of time, and it would have definitely made my life easier, and also finding this identity of being disabled and being proud of it. But also, what is it that the disability community, but also the research community, the network community, providers, how are we not reaching out to certain communities? And specifically for me, immigrant communities, Spanish-speaking communities, yes. You shouldn't have to go to college to find out about all of these things. And so that's kind of the thing that I talk about. My community is not finding out about these things. So what can we do? What are some of the things? And you can come to our panel at 2 that Raquel and I and others are doing to find out more about the Latino community and how to reach out to us. And breaking this dichotomy of, we talk a lot, especially in the disability rights community, also about independence, and that's a very American independent word, that you're going to be independent and be in your bubble and do your own thing. And that doesn't work in my community. In my community, we all work together. We're all a part of helping everybody out. So rephrasing that to say, how can a person with a disability be interdependent to their community that is already interdependent? And so I've worked before as a rehab counselor, and I've had a counselor talk to a client being like, no, we're only going to interview you and we're not going to interview your family. And so the family would leave and never receive services. And it's just the disconnect between understanding independence isn't the goal for a lot of our communities, it's interdependence and how we can work together.
Thank you. This was AUCD, the National Network of Researchers, Clinic, Advocates, Students, and Professors. How can our network best support you and other leaders in the disability movement to achieve your goals? And we'll start again with Haben.
Haben speaking. I think a lot of people with disabilities and teachers and other individuals, family members who are connected to people with disabilities, many don't know about this network and don't know about the resources. If you can help share your information with your communities, that would be a huge asset, and let people with disabilities and their families and teachers know that these opportunities are available. And ways to do that are through the media. When you have great projects, share that in the media. Make sure you provide information in multiple formats, including multiple languages, sign language, Spanish, Amharic. Make sure your websites and digital information is accessible. I can't tell you how many disability organizations do not have accessible websites. Mm-hmm. It's shocking.
Or not.
That includes Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah.
If you post a photo on Twitter, include image descriptions. Instagram, include image descriptions. Video should have captions. All that information should be made accessible. And if you're not sure, there are guidelines that teach how to make the digital content accessible. Web content accessibility guidelines for websites, and for apps, Android and iOS accessibility guidelines. So make sure your content is accessible so that people can learn and benefit from the content.
Maria?
So this is Maria Town. AAPD's mission is to advance the economic and political power of people with disabilities. And I think that there are two very big ways that the AUCD network can help us with this goal. One of the best ways to enhance the economic power of people with disabilities is to do what? Hire them. So every single UCED, every single one of your partners needs to make an intentional effort to hire people with disabilities, and not just hire them in tokenized roles, but hire them in positions within your UCED where they can receive professional development, advance, and earn a living wage. One of the other greatest assets of this network that can really help us improve our political power is all of the fantastic research and data that this network produces. And I've had the honor and privilege to work with many of the researchers who are in this room right now. But research and data need to be accessible and usable to the community to whom it pertains. So if we are working with someone like Liz or Conchita to brief Congress folks on the importance of the Money Follows the Person program, I want to be able to go to UCEDs and get usable data about the importance of home and community-based services. Even for someone like myself who has, a degree from an elite institution, it can be hard to navigate some of the materials that come out of UCEDs. I'm just being very honest. And I think if all UCEDs made a commitment to easy-to-read material and made sure to invest the research and data in the communities that it concerns, that could be enormous in advancing our political power.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on what Maria said. I think there's definitely a disconnect between research and disability rights movement. Mm-hmm. And I'm a researcher, we're snobby, we know we're right. I just took out my hoop. But we know the science, we know the data, we know how powerful the research that we do is. However, how are we including people with disabilities beyond just, hey, I need you to take my survey. Hey, I need you to be a part of my research. I need you to be a guinea pig to see if this thing works. We need to include people with disabilities as collaborative partners from the beginning. I don't know how many emails I get a week that it's like, oh, can you help spread this research? Yeah, who are the researchers? Nobody with a disability. And that's not to say, hire somebody to be your lead researcher who doesn't know anything about research. That's not at all what I'm saying. However, have people with disabilities be a part of the beginning. For all the researchers here, participatory, I can't say the word really good in English, but participatory action research. This idea that we include people from the beginning instead of trying to fix it at the end. It's just like accessibility. And unfortunately, the disability rights movement does not understand research. And it's historic, right? There's been a lot of research that has been tried to eliminate our existence. And so we're hesitant to research, and unfortunately, disability rights organizations don't understand how research is useful. They say, well, we go off of our lived experience, right? So let's bridge the two. Let's have powerful research with lived experience, researchers collaborating with people with disabilities, and that's going to make better outcomes for everybody.
Thank you. This is Liz. Maria, how do you think that leaders with intellectual movement.
Liz, I'm not sure if your mic was working, so I'm going to repeat the question. Liz, this is Maria. Liz asked me, how do I think that leaders with intellectual disabilities can be seen as leaders within the broader disability rights community? I think we've actually spoken a lot to this question already, but I will add a couple of things. First, the broader disability rights community needs to already acknowledge the significance of leaders with intellectual disabilities in this space. Liz, for example, your testimony at the Kavanaugh hearings, that's a seminal moment within the disability rights movement.
And thank you.
You're welcome. You know, Lois Curtis and the Olmstead decision, Betty Williams, I think, influenced the policies of 3 different presidential administrations. And so when we talk about disability history, we need to be making sure that we're including leaders from the intellectual disability space. The other thing that I think that the cross-disability community needs to do is investigate our own internalized ableism, because we have a lot of it. And part of that is making sure that in every meeting that we're conducting and every policy that we're working on, people with intellectual disabilities are at the table, and we are creating, as Haben has discussed, the accessibility that everyone will need to participate, and not saying, oh, this person's going to be really difficult to accommodate, so we just won't invite them. But I also think that IDD spaces can do more to demand a seat at the table. Again, if we want to work with intellectually disabled leaders, I want to be able to go to a UCED and say, what leaders should I be working with, right? And sometimes that can't happen. And so I think, too, we need to make sure that the IDD community is investing in people with intellectual disabilities and making sure that they can grow into leadership roles.
Okay.
Yep.
This is Haben. This is Liz. And Haben and Maria H. And I call her Maria because I can't pronounce her actual name. Our country seems very divided by race, ethnicity, and political party and geography. Do you have any ideas? Do you have ideas for how to bridge some of these divides as we try to advance the disability movement? And we'll start with Haben.
Haben speaking. I am a woman, a person of color. I'm Black. I have multiple disabilities. I have a dog, and I also have a funny computer. When I face discrimination, I don't always know what is the cause. Sometimes they exclude me but don't directly say, oh, it's because you're a woman or because you're Black. Disability, ableism, and ableism is the idea that people with disabilities are inferior to the non-disabled. We're not inferior. But ableism tells society that we are, and we constantly face barriers. So all of these things are connected: ableism, racism, sexism. If someone is left behind, the whole community is left behind. Mm-hmm. If we want to move forward, we need to address all forms of oppression. And it's a constant process of educating. It's also being aware that you can't just work on disability, because disability intersects with the other types of oppression. I've actually encountered a disability group that said, we don't want to talk about race, we don't want to deal with Black Lives Matter, we're just doing disability. That's like saying we're only interested in white, privileged, disabled men.
Yes.
So to truly advance disability rights, you also need to address the other forms of oppression and how they intersect to disability. So make that your goal and plan to work on that.
Yes, I echo what Haben said, and I think we have to start from a point of understanding that our country was built on these issues, right? Our country was built on racism and displacement of people, and we're currently on stolen land having this great conference. So we have to recognize that those are real things that are a part of our history, and so it's not something that's just coming up or that's gonna go away by having a diversity statement, you know? It's not enough to have a diversity statement. You need to do actual work behind it. Organizations. And I really love what Haben said, because a lot of people get really uncomfortable when we start to talk about white privilege, and everybody's like, ugh, you know. And so being able to say, understanding all the different privileges that we have, you know, white privilege, being a man, ableism, all of these things, and how they intersect, and being able to have these conversations without getting defensive, and being able to understand where we stand. So for example, yes, I'm an immigrant, yes, English is my second language, I'm disabled, so I have all these things, but I also do have white privilege. And being able to recognize that and knowing that my life was not made harder due to the color of my skin. And so, for example, my sister definitely looks Mexican, and we both took AP classes when we were in high school. And my presence in these classes was never questioned. However, by teachers, when she was signing up for the class, it was always like, are you sure this is the class you're signing up for? Like, are you sure you can handle the work? So those barriers that those of us who have white privilege need to really understand, it doesn't mean our life was easy, and I think that's the argument, oh, I don't have white privilege, my life was hard. That's not the point. The point is your life wasn't hard because of the white privilege you have. It may have been hard for other issues. So being able to have those conversations within our networks, within our organizations, and doing meaningful things to address them systematically. So how systematically is something in our organization, not intentionally, but how is something in our organization set up that we're excluding folks? So if all of our welcome brochures aren't in another language, how are we excluding people? If our welcome, thank you. If our welcome brochures don't include people of color, how are we welcoming people? You know, if the community that you're working with doesn't have staff that looks like them, how are we welcoming people? So being able to look at it from many facets and being able to look at ourselves and how we fit into that and how we're gonna bring up other leaders. I get asked to be on panels other times, and I'm like, it's all white people, I'm not gonna go. I'm gonna recommend to you other 5 people of color that should be, because we have enough white people representing. So that's it.
Before we open it up, the theme of this conference is Sleep and Change Together. Can you each please share a story about a time when you realized that you were a leader? Haben?
Haben speaking. I'm an advocate and leader now, but when I was younger, I felt really shy. Part of it was because society was always telling me, you don't matter, you don't belong. And it was frustrating, and a lot of people end up internalizing some of that ableism. And over time, I had to work to remove it and resist it. I went to college at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon, and the school did a fantastic job providing me with my course materials in Braille. My exams were in Braille. They even worked with the outdoor club so I could participate in rock climbing and kayaking. We just had one problem on campus. The cafeteria was somewhere where all students would gather to eat, relax between classes. The cafeteria had about 6 different stations. Sighted students would walk in, browse the menu, then go to their station of choice. The menu was only in print. Blind students couldn't read it, not because of blindness, but because of the format of the menu. So I went to the manager and I asked him, can you provide the menu in Braille or post it online or email it to me? I have assistive technology that allows me to do email and websites. He said they're very busy. They have over 1,000 students and don't have time to do special things for students with special needs. Just to be clear, eating is not a special need. There's a myth that there are 2 kinds of people, dependent and independent. That's not true. Everyone is interdependent. Many of you like drinking coffee. Very few grow your own coffee beans. You depend on other people to grow your food and make your computers. It's okay as long as you're honest about the fact that we're all interdependent. The manager didn't recognize this, and he refused to provide access. Back then I was a vegetarian, and it was hard to eat vegetarian when you don't know what the food choices are. There were 6 different stations. I'd go to one at random, get food, find a table, try the food, and discover an unpleasant surprise. It was really frustrating, but I told myself, at least I have food, at least I'm getting an education. Who was I to complain? We engage in the Oppression Olympics where we compare struggles, point to someone and say, they have it worse off, so I'm gonna stop complaining because at least I don't have their problems. That kind of thinking allows hierarchies to persist. It accommodates broken institutions. If we want problems to go away, we have to actually do something about them. And I talked to friends, did research online, then went back to the manager and explained, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination, and if you don't provide access, I'm taking legal action. I had no idea how to do that. I was 19, I couldn't afford a lawyer. But I knew I had to try and do something. The next day, he apologized and promised to make the menus accessible. They actually did start emailing me the menus. Life became delicious. The next year, when a new blind student came to the college, he had immediate access to the menus. And that taught me when I advocate, it helps everyone who comes after me. The small barriers matter. They add up over time. And if we don't address them, we'll still have millions of small barriers in our lives. Address the small barriers, and you'll build up the skills to tackle the larger obstacles. That experience inspired me to go to law school. And I went to Harvard, studied law, and now work as an advocate for people with disabilities. All of us need to do the work to remove barriers, even the small barriers, because it makes a difference.
Maria?
So this is Maria Town, and lately, I've been doing a lot of reflection. That's what happens when you have some major life transitions. And I've been very lucky in many ways because I've been in many leadership positions across a long period of time. But I was trying to figure out, like, where did this sort of come from? And when I was in the first grade, I was mainstreamed, and I had a family who fought very hard for me to be included. I was also very stubborn, and still am. And I was always trying to figure out, how to do everything. And this is something we see a lot in disabled kids. And so, thankfully, I was attending public schools in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There were a number of students in my classes who had disabilities. They may not have known that, they may not have identified. But I actually wasn't teased, and it was often because even though I, had casts on and was using a walker and had an aid, I would also assist other kids with learning disabilities with their reading homework, right? And there was a lot of interdependence happening in my elementary school classrooms. So what this meant is that when we went on the playground and kids were jumping rope, I was turning, right? I could stand there and hold onto my walker and turn the rope. I couldn't jump, but I could turn. So then I wanted to do the monkey bars, all right? What did I do? I organized. I recruited all of these other kids to hoist me up and help me move through the monkey bars. And of course, all of us got in trouble. Every single one of us. And I was a very compliant and obedient child, even though I was also stubborn. And so when my mom gets this report that I was rabble-rousing on the playground, I got in trouble at home too. And so the reason I tell this story is not to say that this is a moment when I was a leader, even though I think I was. I want to tell you about what I wish would have happened. Right, so you see this group of children who have banded together. So this one child who is definitely disabled has a chance to play, literally on the same playground with her peers. We all get in trouble, and you can warn those children about the danger of what they were doing, but you can also say, how can we figure out more opportunities for these children to play together? And instead of just calling... Instead of just calling my mother and telling her how bad I've been, why couldn't you say, well, Miss Town, how can we help support you to explore adaptive play opportunities for your daughter? And I did not have the vocabulary yet to say I want to be more included in sports. And ultimately, when my mom tried to find opportunities for me to be included in sports, she was turned away. But I tell this story because we're all leaders from very, very early ages. Haben, you talked about being 19, but I can point to when I was 6. And I think when we see students with disabilities who are being leaders, even to this day in 2019, 25 years after my little escapade on the monkey bars, we are still seeing students being punished for being non-compliant, when what they're trying to do is be a leader within their own life. And so I want to see us think differently about positive behavioral supports, right? And when we see a child trying to demonstrate self-determination in the classroom, we say, they're trying to be a leader in their own life. Let's support this and not criminalize it.
Yeah, and this is Conchita speaking. I keep forgetting to say that. And you made a good point about we've been leaders since children. It's just what does leadership look like in different communities? It's a little bit different. And sometimes we have a very elite way of looking at leadership, so we don't recognize when communities are organizing. So like when I was in high school, it made me remember, I was undocumented, there was all these things happening. And so I was organizing student walkouts and all these things. And it wasn't seen as like a leadership thing. It was just, that's what you were doing in your community. And it's funny because I still kind of pinch myself because I'm like, I still think of myself as like a 6-year-old who doesn't speak English, who can't really see. So sometimes I have like this imposter syndrome of like, do I really belong in these spaces? And so being able to have other people in these spaces kind of recognize that work and what that looks like. And a time specifically where that comes to mind is, so through my nonprofit, we work a lot in Mexico, reaching out with around blindness issues. So we work with professionals, teaching them evidence-based practices. We work with families, we work with students. And this summer we ran our first big conference across the country, and it was really well attended. We had people from all across the country attend. We even had people from Canada and other Latin American countries attend. And one of the things that was really powerful is, I think, bringing together the research aspect of it that we could share with professionals. Hey, these are the best practices that are happening. This is how you can, these are therapies, this is instruction, these are interventions. But then also coupling it with, we're part of the disability rights movement, and you can be proud of, you know, having a blind child, and your child can grow up to live a fulfilling life. So I think we need to kind of reimagine what leadership looks like. And when we're recruiting for leadership, I think we tend to recruit people like me who are really outspoken and loud, and there's a lot of introverts that are really good leaders, and we don't necessarily pick them to be in spaces of power because they're really smart. They're doing harder work than we do as extroverts. We just talk a lot. And they don't always get recognized. So I think leadership doesn't look like one thing. It looks like, you know, Haben organizing in her college. It looks like Maria doing on the monkey bars. It looks like an advocate coming to an event for the first time and realizing that this is where they belong. And I promised Andy I wasn't going to cry, but that's what I do. So that's it. So just reimagining kind of what leadership looks like and how we can all help people who may not see themselves as leaders and build them up within our networks.
Thank you. And our first question from the audience is, how do you promote change and happen? How do you promote change?
Haben speaking, how do I promote change? I'm aware that there's so many small barriers in our communities, barriers affecting women, people of color, people with disabilities, barriers that intersect and impact people who live in all those experiences. And I promote change by addressing one barrier at a time. And it's exhausting work. I'm constantly aware of how much there still needs to be, how much we still need to do. But I just keep working on it, one barrier at a time. Stories are really powerful. So this summer I published a book that's a collection of stories that help people identify ableism. Thank you. It helps people identify ableism and work to remove ableism. If we can get more people in our society aware, then hopefully more people will address it and remove it so it's no longer a barrier.
This is Maria Town, and I'm going to change the question slightly and ask, how do we promote change together? There are two very tangible ways that we can promote change together that have a big impact. Justin Dart, the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, said, "Vote as if your life depends on it, because it does." AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, has an initiative called Rev Up. Rev Up stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. And through Rev Up, we have 32 state coalitions of disability partners who are dedicated to getting people with disabilities registered to vote. I unfortunately can't think of the 18 states where we don't have coalitions, but I'm going to follow up with Andy and Sachin and Rylan and say, where are your USEDs in these states and how can we work with them? In 2018, the disability vote grew an enormous percentage. We had more people turning out. The thing is, though, even with this growth, we continue to experience gaps in registration and in turnout. And I think particularly for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, it is so incredibly important that they understand that they have the right to vote and can receive accommodations at the polls. I'll say one more thing on this. Often when I look at policies focused on disability and voting, the first thing that comes up is the absentee ballot. And the absentee ballot is a very important and crucial strategy for people with disabilities, older adults, to engage in our democratic process. However, it should not be the primary strategy used to encourage people with disabilities to vote. People with disabilities should be able to show up to their polling place just like everybody else, and every single polling place should be prepared to accommodate every voter. All means all. So I gave you a Justin Dart quote, and I'm going to modify this. I'm going to say, get counted in the census as if your life depends on it, because it does. The census is the way that our government apportions power and money, right? So many federal dollars and the direct benefits that many in your network, and maybe you yourself, rely on to thrive, depend on the census. And Conchita spoke to this a little bit. There are so many communities living in fear who don't want to get counted because of the risk that it puts them at, and it's understandable. But your network, your centers, your lens are trusted community partners and can play a significant role in making sure that everyone gets counted so that your states get appropriate amounts of Medicaid dollars, right? Of supplemental nutritional assistance program dollars, like literally money for people to eat and remain healthy. So vote as if your life depends on it, because it does. Get counted in the census as if your life depends on it, because it literally does.
Yeah, and I think this question can be interpreted so many different ways. Yeah. And I think for me, it's collaborate. There's so many people here that have so much knowledge, research-based practitioners, advocates, people with disabilities, and we don't always communicate and collaborate with each other. And when we do, we can do a lot of change, a lot of growth, and talking to marginalized voices. So I think Sachin mentioned earlier, don't just have people with disabilities, and Maria mentioned as well, as token people on your boards, or as, the person who does our accessibility and nothing else and isn't included in everything. Have a connection with people with disabilities, be a part of the communities that you serve, collaborate so that we can all be healthy together, all live a good life together, and strategize. How are we strategize about our financial means, we strategize about our missions and our visions. Let's strategize about how we're going to be reaching our most marginalized communities, about how we're going to be working together. There was a really good quote that I heard at a conference that said, don't be the shining star, be part of the constellation. And I think it's such a powerful thing. There's so many egos, and especially the academic space, that sometimes, it's true. I'm one of those people too, so I can say it. But we know what we know, and it's valuable, and our voice is important. However, we can't be the shining star without collaborating with everybody, because together we can do a lot of difference. There's been amazing research done where they have two different groups. One group where it's all experts in the field, and it's a very not diverse group, and they're trying to solve a problem. And another group where it's a diverse group of people, and they may not all be experts in the field, but they all have different perspectives. And a big chunk of the time, and I'm not going to say exact percentage because I don't remember, but a big chunk of the time, the diverse perspective group will solve the problem more than just the experts in the field. So we have to take that and apply it into our networks, into our systems, on how we can all be be a constellation together, because we're all working for the same goal, so that people with disabilities, so that whole communities will thrive, and we'll do that by working together.
Thank you. What questions do you want researchers to study and answer? Haben?
Haben speaking. I want researchers to study how people with disabilities drive innovation. A lot of us come up with our own solutions at home, in our communities, but the stories of innovation, of creating solutions, finding a way to get on monkey bars, these stories need to get out so more people learn about them. And if more people knew these stories, then society would shift from seeing people with disabilities as incompetent to seeing people with disabilities as talented and collaborative and people who drive innovation. So help gather these stories, document them, and share them with the world.
Maria?
This is Maria Town. That's a very hard question, and there's a lot of things I want researchers to look at, but I actually will say, for anything that you're researching and collecting data for, please collect disability status, gender, race, and sexual orientation. It can be so difficult to find data that looks at queer, disabled women of color, right? And Haben talked about the barriers that we face constantly, small and large. And when we are trying to determine how communities are impacted by these barriers, we need data to back us up. But that data needs to actually reflect the communities that exist within the broader disability community and the disability rights movement. And I'll say again, it is just so difficult to find consistent, reliable data that looks at the whole person. So for anything you're researching, please collect disability, gender, race, and sexual orientation status.
So this is a subject that I love, so I can talk about years about this. But I think I'm a huge advocate for early intervention services. It makes a huge difference in the outcomes of people with disabilities. Whether they are mainstreamed, whether they can become employed, that early intervention is so important. And research has been done how, for blind students specifically, they will have a hard time creating a bond with their parents. That is called mutual regulation. It's how you connect with your parents and create a bond that helps you for the rest of your life. So blind students have a hard time connecting with their parents, not because of the loss of vision, but rather because parents have the same symptoms of parents with depression. So they feel very anxious that their child has a disability, and so they present some depression-like symptoms, and so that blocks them from being able to connect with their child. So if we can reach those parents in early intervention and present them with role models and what the expectations are, and there is a lot of research being done in early intervention, which makes me really happy. But throughout, I want to see more research on kind of specific to disabilities, what the barriers and I guess strengths of the different disabilities, and then looking at resilience and how that plays a role in it. So let's say somebody with autism. So what are the barriers that they're having in school? What are the barriers they're having in employment? What are the barriers that they're having socially? And then we can create interventions to help them do better. And so my research is actually looking at English learners that are blind and low vision and what their barriers are in high school. What are they not doing well? What are they struggling with? And not looking at it as inherent to blindness, but inherent to the system they're in. And so then we can provide interventions once we know what those barriers are, instead of just focusing research on how do we cure this disease and cure that disease and do that. And that's needed research. I'm not saying not to do it. However, we need to really focus on what the barriers are to people with disabilities living their lives. So then all you as UCEDs can provide the services that are happening. And some of that is happening, and you all are a part of that. So continue in that vein.
And I think we have time for one more question, and this is one of my favorite questions. What are your thoughts on the term self-advocate and why and how? We'll start with you.
Haben speaking. I'm laughing because we had a great conversation about this last night.
We did.
And there were some differing opinions, and it was fun to lean into the complexities and hear about the differing opinions. My opinion is that everyone, or most of us, start out very focused on our own lives. When you are young, you only know your perspective. And as you grow up, you start to learn about other perspectives, and you start to learn about injustice and learning how to remove injustice so you can have access. So if we're lucky, we get to become self-advocates and help remove barriers that stand in our way. Then, if we have the generosity, we'll use those skills and talents, the skills and talents we use to remove barriers for ourselves, and use it for the greater community and advocate for the whole community rather than just for ourselves. So it's my hope that more people transition from tolerating oppression to being self-advocates to being leaders for the whole community. Everyone is on their own journey and does this at different times and stages. But I hope more people work to remove barriers, not just for themselves, not just for their kind, but for the whole disability community.
This is Maria Town speaking. I have a great deal of respect for the term self-advocate because I have a great deal of respect for the self-advocacy movement within the broader disability rights community. And I know so many people who the identity self-advocate was their way in to broader advocacy. And so I think it's important, and the broader cross-disability rights movement, we sort of rag on the term self-advocate a lot. And I want us as a movement to stop doing that. Because I think it is a reflection of our own ableism around intellectual disabilities. And I also think, as I was mentioning before, that it neglects to recognize the impact of people with intellectual disabilities within the larger disability rights movement. So personally, I use the identity self-advocate very intentionally, particularly in spaces where it is still, unfortunately, a radical idea that people with disabilities can speak for themselves. And the thing that I don't like about the word or the phrase self-advocate is not the people who identify with it, it's how that label has been used to further marginalize people with intellectual disabilities. Whether it is within the larger developmental disability community or within the disability rights community. I think if someone is in front of us identifying as a self-advocate, we need to say, come on board, we have a lot of work to do together.
This, Conchita, and this kind of reminds me of the whole person first, identity first language, especially in the field that I work in. We discuss it a lot, and there's a lot of strong feelings around it. And first of all, an individual should be able to define themselves however the heck they want to define themselves. So we should not be policing, oh, no, you should call yourself this, you should call yourself that. I think definitely education on, well, this is why I call myself this and what that means, and this is why I call myself that. I was recently trying to put a paper in for publication in a journal, and they would not accept my entry because I did not use person first language. And I literally was like, I'm gonna counter you with more research about other people that are using it. And so they finally gave in and were like, fine, we'll let you submit your paper using identity first language. But I think we need to have the space for that everybody can identify themselves how they want. And recognizing that the larger disability rights movement really marginalizes people with intellectual disabilities. We're not as inclusive as we should be, as we need to be, and we need to do better. And that includes letting people identify as self-advocates when it's right for them, and not telling them, you know, we don't do that in this space, we call ourselves this. So everybody should have the availability to change, and I use terms based on the spaces I'm in. Like if I'm in an academic space, I'll say I'm a person with a disability. If I'm at the Department of Education, you know, I'm trying to educate them a little bit more, so I might say, you know, I'm a self-advocate with a disability. So it just really depends on where I am and what I'm trying to gain with my presence in that space. And I think having people identify however it is that they want to.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but I wanted to thank Haben, Maria, and Maria for this amazing panel and this amazing discussion about, and I just wanted to say with the leadership of all of us, with Sachin leading this organization, we're in a really wonderful position to go far, far. Thank you.
Thank you for being a great moderator.